I want to call finally on my friend Derek Chollet. Derek is the Executive Vice President of the German Marshall Fund, which I mentioned I've been a trustee for some time. He is one of the most respected, certainly one of the most quoted commentators on foreign policy. Derek served in the White House and the Pentagon under the Obama administration, finally as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security, historically one of the truly important jobs in the U.S. government. Derek.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. I also want to extend my appreciation to the Marshall Center and the Marshall House for hosting this wonderful event. I have to say, despite the rain, just looking out at this bucolic setting, it beats spending the afternoon in Washington. So I appreciate being here. I have to say it's a little bit intimidating to bat cleanup on this panel after three terrific presentations and coming after a wonderful speech by Secretary Albright in an incredibly rich morning. It reminds me of something a former boss of mine at the Pentagon, Chuck Hagel, Secretary of Defense, previously had been a U.S. Senator, and what he used to say about the U.S. Senate, which is that everything has been said, but I haven't had a chance to say it. So I will try to be brief. I'll try to give you just a few quick thoughts on the Marshall Plan's legacy, and we'll really look forward to the conversation. Probably like many of you, in preparing for this anniversary, I found myself going back to my library, reading some books that I hadn't looked at for quite some time, or reading some books for the first time about the history that led to the Marshall Plan. And one that really struck with me was one that I actually read in college some years ago, but that was published in 1955. And it was by Joseph Jones, who was one of the relatively junior architects of the Marshall Plan, called the 15 Weeks. And of course, he was talking about the 15 weeks starting in January of 1947, when George Marshall was called back from vacation to be informed by our British colleagues that they were not going to be able to support Greece and Turkey in the way that they had thought, and that the U.S. was going to be expected to step up. And the amazing period of policy development that started then and then concluded 15 weeks later, 70 years ago today, on June 5th, when Secretary Marshall stood up in Harvard Yard and gave his historic speech. It's the story, that book is the story of the making of the Marshall Plan, and it's really the story of America becoming a world leader. And here we are today, looking back on what has been a momentous 20 weeks, from the end of January until today. And it's a very different set of policies unfolding, but possibly we're at a moment as consequential as the one that Joseph Jones wrote about some time ago. One cannot help but compare the two periods, and I think we should be asking ourselves if we are witnessing the dismantling of the world that the 15 weeks helped create. As David put it, are we present at the destruction? So it is very fitting that we are gathered here to assess the lessons of the 15 weeks and the relevance and the lessons of the Marshall Plan for today. And it's important for us to remember the Marshall Plan's intellectual underpinnings and what made it possible. And I'll start with the intellectual underpinnings. These are things that we are still debating in our foreign policy debate today, and I'll point out five very briefly. First, the enduring American interest in a free and democratic Europe. Now, if you think back to the Marshall Plan period, 1947, 48, 49, this was the beginning of what we now think of as the transatlantic relationship. That there was something unique about the U.S.-European partnership, both to bring stability to Europe, but as the years went on, to export that stability around the world. There was a view that is encapsulated by the Marshall Plan that the United States cannot stand apart from Europe, and that a unified Europe, a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace, as George H.W. Bush would later put it, was essential to American security. This meant that the United States championed European integration, it championed European democratization, and it championed European prosperity. This was not something that was just charity we were doing for others, it was intrinsic to America's national security interests. So that's the first intellectual underpinning. The second, it directly ties American power and the future of America's security to the spread of democracy. Dr. Sorrell mentioned that this was building very much on the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. But of course, as we all know from the history books, that was a difficult legacy, one that was ultimately unsuccessful in President Wilson's time. But this was an understanding and a view that U.S. interest rested on standing up for democracy around the world, and it was important for the United States to expend our resources in helping to democracy to take root and spread. Now, this has been at the core of American foreign policy since the Marshall Plan, from waging the Cold War to the efforts to build a democratic peace after the Cold War ended a quarter century ago. Spreading democracies was core at the rationale for the enlargement of the NATO alliance in Eastern and Central Europe and for American support for the European Union. But of course, whether or not the U.S. should stand up for democracy around the world, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere, is very much under question right now. Third, intellectual underpinning, that the United States needs to be in the business of building a world order, that no one else will step up. The Marshall Plan was premised on American leadership in developing global and regional institutions, or what we foreign policy wonks call the architecture of global governance. This was a quintessentially maximalist American approach. This was a moment for American foreign policy where the U.S. understood that it needed to step up. Of course, we invited European input. We had an appearance of allied buy-in to this project. But ultimately, there was a sense that the United States had to run the show. And without U.S. leadership, it would not have happened. Now, we, again, are hearing echoes of these arguments today, whether it's about America's role in addressing climate change and whether or not we should be part of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, or the future of NATO and whether the U.S. interest should be tied to the strength of this regional security alliance, or America's role in the Asia Pacific and whether or not the United States should be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Still, these questions of whether we should be in the business of building a world order. And I think the question we should ask ourselves is, if we're not going to be in the business of building a world order, are others capable and willing to step up? And if so, is that consistent with our interests? As we've seen, the very concept that underpins the idea of building a world order, the idea that there's a global community, is something that is questioned by those in the administration today, as we saw in a Wall Street Journal op-ed by the National Security Advisor and the National Economic Advisor last week. Fourth, intellectual underpinning. The Marshall Plan stresses the importance of economic and political development, that soft power mattered as much as hard power in American foreign policy. The Marshall Plan broadened the concept of what it means to be strong, of American strength, to be more than just military might. The Marshall Plan stressed the importance of America's diplomatic, economic, ideological, and cultural strength. The whole idea of food security comes out of the Marshall Plan, as we've heard. Dean Acheson called the fundamental point of the Marshall Plan food and fuel. That's how we were going to win the Cold War. Dr. Sorrell's offered a new one today with the GRIP, or maybe in the spirit of the moment, it's the Sorrell Plan from here on out. Now, I think it was essential that the Marshall Plan was championed by one of America's most heralded military officers. It mattered the general was out there pushing this. And we, again, hear echoes of that again today when it's our generals, either current or retired generals, who are the biggest champions of American soft power and for a robust State Department and USAID budget. General Mattis has a great quote we've heard a lot of recently, which he says, you know, if you don't give the State Department the money it needs in its budget, or USAID the money it needs in its budget, you're just going to have to buy me more bullets. And I think we'll see in the budget debates coming up this fall, many of our military voices returning to the fore when it comes to the question of whether we should have a large foreign assistance and State Department budget. The fifth and final underpinning is really the other side of the same coin, which is the Marshall Plan, although it is focused on diplomacy and development, it also recognized that one cannot have economic and political development without conventional security. And the founding of the NATO alliance, of course, is a key part of the Marshall legacy. It explicitly connected security to economic prosperity. And by the way, that was over the objections of many European and Soviet specialists in the State Department at the time, including George Kennan. Now, this is why the United States has invested so much in the NATO alliance over the last 7 decades, and why for the past 2 decades, presidents of both political parties have sought to modernize the NATO alliance to make it stronger. And it's why the United States still believes that the military defense of Europe is essential, and it is why the concept of mutual defense, which we've been talking a lot about for the last several weeks, related to the so-called Article 5 commitment to the NATO alliance, the Mutual Self-Defense Alliance, why that remains so important. So these 5 intellectual underpinnings, the importance of transatlantic relations, and a strong and unified Europe, the defense of democracy, the necessity of building a US-led international order, the importance of soft power to American influence abroad, the importance of traditional security as well. These have been at the foundation of American foreign policy for 7 decades. But Marshall's legacy is about more than a set of ideas. It's also important to remember how it got done. And many believe that the Marshall Plan was the most significant foreign policy achievement in American foreign policy. And the factors that made it successful, made it possible, remain very relevant today. And I'll focus very briefly on 3. First, it would not have been possible without the political skill of the President, President Truman, and the strength of the Secretary of State and the State Department. It's remarkable, as David reminded us, it's remarkable at the time how weak President Truman was seen. I mean, he was unelected. He was someone who was just taken office because of FDR's death. He paled in comparison to FDR. He had just been shellacked in the midterm elections in 1946. We had a Republican Congress for the first time in about 18 years. Yet with the March 1947 Truman Doctrine speech, he laid the foundation, President Truman laid the foundation for the Marshall Plan. And he was also extremely skilled in selling the plan to the American people and to the Congress. Now, one of his most skilled moves was by letting this plan be owned by George Marshall. He understood that General Marshall was his strongest selling point, his strongest asset. He knew that anything going to the Congress at that time with his name on it would, as he said at the time, quiver a couple times, turn belly up, and die. And that even, as he said, he told his colleague Clark Clifford, he said, even the worst Republican would vote for something with General Marshall's name on it. So it's a reminder that you can get a lot done if you don't really care about who gets the credit. And Truman was willing to let Marshall get the credit. But it wasn't as though Marshall was just window dressing here. I mean, his leadership was absolutely essential, as was that of his team. And it was really a kind of murderer's row of diplomatic talent at the State Department at the time with Dean Acheson and George Kennan, Robert Lovett, who were all indispensable in the creation and the execution of the Marshall Plan. And it reminds us, because what it shows is what a strong State Department can accomplish. And that stands, of course, in stark contrast today when, unfortunately, we're seeing a State Department that's facing historic budget cuts and a massive personnel crisis. The second reason the Marshall Plan was possible or was able to get achieved was it was one of the great bipartisan efforts. This is when an administration led by Democrats worked hand in glove with a congressional leadership led by Republicans. And just as George Marshall is on the Mount Rushmore of secretaries of state, Arthur Vandenberg, senator from Michigan, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, is one of the finest who have ever held that seat. both sides learned lessons from the disastrous League of Nations fight between Woodrow Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge several decades earlier. And the level of coordination between the Truman administration and the congressional leadership was remarkable. Vandenberg and Marshall would meet twice a week at Blair House alone to plot strategy. Marshall said that they could not have been any closer unless they sat on each other's laps. Now, one wonders if such close cooperation between folks on Capitol Hill and administration, particularly of two different parties, would ever be possible again. Finally, this passed because the politicians, the leaders of our country, made the case domestically, and they sold it to the American people. David, on his Google search, the Marshall Plans, it's at 7,000 or so. One that might have been the first reference to the Marshall Plan I read in a book, which was they created a Marshall Plan to pass the Marshall Plan. It was all hands on deck effort. They did it aggressively. It also reflected great faith in the American people to be ready to sacrifice, to undertake risks, without knowing if something was going to work or not. They couldn't make promises that all this money that they were asking the American taxpayer to spend was actually going to accomplish the goal. This had never been tried before. So fundamentally, the Marshall Plan was an act of confidence, not just in policy ideas, but confidence in the American people to see these policy ideas through. So needless to say, the factors that made implementing the Marshall Plan ideas possible, a strong Secretary of State leading an empowered State Department with a politically skilled, magnanimous president, a bipartisan approach with the Congress, and a commitment to appeal to the better angels of the American people, those are not very apparent today. So will the 20 weeks of 2017 bury the legacy of the 15 weeks of 1947? Secretary Albright mentioned a quote by President Truman talking about the Marshall Plan as a dividing line between the past and the future. Are we at another of these dividing lines? I do think we have reason to worry. Today we hear ugly echoes of the past. Of course, the Marshall Plan was a complete repudiation of America First, that argument that had so much momentum before World War II, but yet now, America First, that banner flies proudly at the White House. And consider the words our politicians use. At the highest levels, U.S. leaders look out at the world and snarl against conspiracies that are, and I quote, so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous such instance in the history of man. These politicians decry draining taxpayer dollars abroad for a, quote, massive and unrewarding boondoggle, which only turns the U.S. into, quote, the patsy of the modern world. Now that sounds familiar, right? Maybe it's from the Rose Garden last week? Close. That's Joe McCarthy talking about George Marshall in 1951. That boondoggle he's talking about, that's the Marshall Plan. So this moment is the most direct threat to the Marshall legacy in 6 decades since McCarthy. Like today, that era was also extremely bitter and extremely toxic, and U.S. fundamental values were at stake. But it's important to remember that we came out of that darkness and that our political system proved resilient. And in 1947, looking at the ruin of Europe and the tremendous challenges we still had here at home, I don't think anyone would have imagined the tremendous progress the world would have made and the progress and prosperity that we enjoyed for the next 7 decades. That's why it is so important for us to remember the history that was made as a result of what happened during the 15 weeks 70 years ago, and that this history is reason for us to have hope. Because this was, as Joseph Jones wrote in concluding his book describing that time, one of the rare moments when our leaders thought not in terms of what could be done or what should be done. It was a time of courage, a time of bold decision, and of generous response. And that is what we must aspire to today. Thank you very much.